Genoa Township, Wisconsin, September 1911. The air held the first crisp warning of the winter to come, a scent of cold iron on the north wind that hurried the squirrels and sent a shiver through the men finishing their harvest. On a small plot of land bordering the great Cattail marsh of the Kickapoo River, a man was doing something strange, something deeply foolish. His name was Cesare Baldassari, an Italian immigrant new to the valley, and he was wrapping his newly built log cabin in swamp weeds. He didn't call them weeds. He called them canna palustris, the same name his grandfather had used in the Po Valley of Italy. To the other settlers, they were just cattails, the tall, sausage-headed reeds that choked the lowlands, useless for anything but muskrat lodges and children's games. But Cesare was harvesting them by the armload, hundreds upon hundreds, laying them out to dry in the late autumn sun. Then, with a quiet, methodical rhythm, he began to lash them to his cabin. He had nailed horizontal cedar battens every 2 feet up the log walls, and now he was tying thick, 4-inch bundles of the dried reeds to them, starting from the foundation and working his way up to the eaves, a full 12 feet. Rutherford Poindexter, the Vernon County building inspector, stopped his buggy on the road to watch. Poindexter was a man who believed in plumb lines, square corners, and the accumulated wisdom of Wisconsin builders. He saw a 16 by 20-foot log cabin, competently built, now being dressed in what looked like a giant, flammable grass skirt. He shook his head, a gesture of both pity and professional irritation. "That's the damnedest fool thing I've ever seen," he said to his passenger, a land agent from Viroqua. "The man's building a fire hazard, not a house." He made a note on his clipboard. He wasn't the only one who thought so. Neighbors would slow their wagons, point, and mutter. They called it the Hairy House, or Baldassari's Folly. The consensus was clear. The Italian was a good man, a hard worker, but he was touched in the head. The first winter in Wisconsin would teach him a lesson his old country clearly had not. The cold was not a joke, and it did not suffer foolish experiments. What did this Etruscan descent reed thatcher from the Po Valley understand about the physics of still air that the experienced, practical-minded builders of the Wisconsin frontier had missed? What secret was hidden inside the hollow stems of a common cattail? I promise you, if you stay with me, you will learn something profound about how heat moves, how ancient wisdom can outsmart modern convention, and how one family survived a polar winter not with brute force, but with a coat of summer air. If you appreciate stories of quiet genius and earned vindication, consider subscribing to this channel and hitting the like button. And let me know in the comments, what's the most unconventional building material you've ever seen used? Cesare Baldassari was not a carpenter. He was not a farmer, not a lumberman, not a frontiersman. He was a canaiolo, a reed worker, from a family that had managed the marshes of the Po River Delta for 1,000 years, a tradition stretching back to Roman times and some said even to the Etruscans. His hands knew the heft of a reed scythe, the precise tension of a bundling knot, the smell of drying cattails, a scent of baked earth and faint spice that was the smell of his childhood. He had not worked with heavy timbers or mortared stone. He had worked with hollow stems, woven mats, and the subtle architecture of trapped air. His people built with the marsh itself, creating structures for drying fish, storing grain, and even cladding the north-facing walls of stone farmhouses against the damp, biting winds that swept down from the Alps. He understood that a wall's strength wasn't just in what it stopped, but in what it held. He had come to America with his wife, Julia, and their 2 small children, Marco and Sophia, drawn by promises of land and opportunity, specifically to the Italian-settled marshlands near Genoa, Wisconsin, a place named for the home of other immigrants. It looked, in the hazy light of a summer afternoon, so much like the wetlands he had left behind. But he soon learned that the Wisconsin winter was a different beast entirely. It was not the damp chill of the Po Valley. It was a dry, predatory cold, an active force that sought out every crack and flaw with relentless pressure. Their first winter, in a hastily rented cabin, was a catalogue of failures. It was a winter so cold, a neighbor's cast-iron cheese press screw, a tool built for immense pressure, snapped at the collar on its first turn in the unheated barn. It was a winter so cold, the ink in the parish register at the local church froze solid in its well before the first morning bell had finished ringing. In their own cabin, Julia's prized wool coat, a fine garment she had brought from Italy, hung on a peg near the wall. One morning, reaching for it, she found the wool had become so brittle with frost that the shoulder cracked like a dry leaf when she touched it. The children slept in their coats, huddled together, their breath pluming in the air of their own bedroom. Cesare burned through his woodpile at a terrifying rate, feeding the potbelly stove until it glowed cherry red, yet the walls remained coated in a shimmering layer of interior ice. The heat, it seemed, simply vanished into the logs. He knew they would not survive many winters like that. That spring he looked not to the forest for bigger logs, but to the marsh for a different answer. The problem wasn't the cold. The cold was a constant. The problem was the house. The standard Wisconsin log cabin, the symbol of frontier resilience, was a thermal catastrophe. It was a design born of necessity and available materials, not of thermal efficiency. The settlers, men like Cesare's neighbors, the hard-working Norwegian, Larsen, and the meticulous German, Schmidt, were masters of their craft. Their axe work was flawless, their dovetail notches tight as a drum. They built strong, durable structures that could withstand wind and snow load. But they were building against the wrong enemy. They built for structure, not for warmth. The enemy wasn't the storm, it was the second law of thermodynamics. Heat naturally moves to cold, and the log wall was a veritable highway for that movement. A solid pine or oak log, even a foot thick, has an R value, a measure of thermal resistance of about 1 per inch. A 12-inch log wall was R12 at best, but that assumed perfect construction. In reality, the chinking between the logs was the true weak point. Mortar, mud, moss, whatever was used, would shrink and expand at a different rate than the wood. Tiny cracks would open, invisible gaps that became conduits for air infiltration. On a windy day, a candle flame would dance and flicker inside a well-built cabin, the owner oblivious to the fact that he was losing a battle of air pressure. The wind outside would force cold air in through 1,000 tiny gaps, while the rising heat from the stove would escape through the ceiling and upper walls. Larsen, in his stout cabin, would burn through 15 cords of wood in a winter, a monumental labor of felling, bucking, splitting, and stacking, only to spend his nights listening to the wind whistle through his walls. Schmidt, whose joinery was the envy of the county, found his stored potatoes frozen solid in his root cellar, the cold having seeped through the stone foundation. They were fighting a losing battle, throwing more fuel on the fire in a desperate attempt to overwhelm the constant, silent theft of warmth by the structure itself. They saw the problem as needing more heat. Cesare saw the problem as losing the heat you already had. He understood that a log is a solid, and heat travels easily through solids via conduction. The answer wasn't a thicker solid. The answer was to wrap the solid in something that wasn't a solid at all. The answer was to wrap it in air. The harvest began in late August, when the cattail heads were mature, but before they burst. Cesare, with Julia's help, waded into the marsh that bordered their property, the water cool against their legs. He used a short, curved scythe, the same kind his father had used, cutting the reeds at their base, just below the waterline. He worked with a fluid efficiency that belied the effort, laying the cut reeds carefully onto a small, flat-bottomed boat he'd built, ensuring the delicate, hollow stems weren't crushed. Back on dry land, they spread the reeds in long, neat rows under the sun. For weeks, the air around their property was filled with that unique, earthy scent of drying vegetation. The children, Marco and Sophia, played among the rows, their small hands learning the feel of the smooth, round stems. Once the reeds were dry, with a moisture content low enough that a stem would snap with a clean crack, the real work began. Cesare built a simple wooden frame, a jig for bundling. He would gather a thick bunch of cattails, enough to form a bundle 4 inches in diameter when compressed, and lay them in the jig. He'd use jute twine, wrapping it tightly around the bundle every foot. The result was a dense, semi-rigid cylinder of cattail reeds, 4 inches thick and 8 feet long. He made hundreds of them. The pile grew into a golden brown haystack next to the cabin. Meanwhile, he prepared the cabin itself. Using rough-sawn cedar boards, he created a grid of horizontal battens, nailing them directly to the logs. These battens were 2 inches thick, creating an initial air gap between the logs and what was to come. Then, starting at the bottom, he began lashing the cattail bundles to the battens. He worked his way up, course by course, the bundles overlapping like giant shingles. The cabin began to disappear, its familiar log texture vanishing beneath a thick, bristly coat of reeds. He covered all 4 walls, from the stone foundation to the eaves, a continuous, unbroken blanket of cattail. He even clad the roof, laying the bundles over the existing board sheathing, before adding a final layer of cedar shakes to protect the reeds from the worst of the rain and snow. The visual transformation was shocking. The log cabin, a symbol of rustic strength, now looked soft, organic, almost alive. It had fur. The sharp corners were rounded, the flat planes turned into a textured, undulating surface. It looked less like a building and more like a creature of the marsh that had come to rest on the land. This was when Rutherford Poindexter made his official visit. He'd heard the talk, but seeing it was another matter. He walked around the structure, his face a mask of disbelief. He poked at a bundle with his walking stick. It was firm, but it yielded slightly. "Mr. Baldassari," he began, his voice tight with the strain of professional composure. "What in God's name is this?" Cesare, who was fitting a final bundle near the chimney, paused his work. His English was deliberate, learned in night classes in Chicago. "It is a coat for the house," he said simply. Poindexter's eyes narrowed. He pointed his stick towards the stone chimney. "Sir, the Wisconsin State Fire Code of 1907, Section 4, Paragraph B is very clear. No Class 1 combustible material shall be placed within 3 feet of a flue opening for a residential heating appliance." He gestured at the cattails, which were right up against the chimney stones. "This," he said, his voice rising, "is a tinderbox. A single spark from that chimney, and this whole affair goes up like a torch. You have created a public nuisance and a mortal danger to your own family. I am citing you." He wrote out the citation on his clipboard. It ordered Cesare to remove the non-compliant combustible cladding by May 1st, or face fines and possible condemnation of the dwelling. Cesare looked at the paper Poindexter handed him. He looked at the thick, golden walls of his home. He looked at Julia, who stood in the doorway, her face pale with worry. He nodded slowly. "I understand," he said. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket. Then he turned, picked up his tools, and went back to finishing the last bundle. The building inspector, having delivered his professional judgment, got back in his buggy and drove away, shaking his head at the Italian's stubborn foolishness. The mockery of the neighbors was one thing. A legal citation was another. The test of the winter was no longer just about comfort. It was now about survival and justification. To understand why Cesare Baldassari was not a fool, but a genius, you have to understand the profound difference between a solid and a gas. Rutherford Poindexter saw a wall of dried grass, a solid fuel waiting for a spark. Cesare saw a wall of air, trapped, unmoving, still air. Heat moves in three ways: conduction through direct contact, convection through the movement of fluids like air or water, and radiation through electromagnetic waves. The log wall failed because it was a solid, a good conductor. The wind-stealing warmth was a failure of convection. Cesare's cattail coat was a masterpiece of thermal warfare designed to defeat both. The magic is inside the cattail stem. If you slice one open, you'll see it's not a solid straw. It's a complex structure of parenchyma, a spongy tissue filled with enormous air spaces. In fact, a dry cattail stem is approximately 90% air by volume. This isn't moving air. It's air trapped in millions of tiny, fibrous pockets. And still air is one of the best insulators on the planet. It's a terrible conductor of heat. It's the principle behind goose-down fiberglass and modern foam insulation. Let's do the math. The R value of cattail fiber is estimated to be around R3 per inch. Cesare's bundles were 4 inches thick. That means his cattail cladding provided a thermal resistance of R12. But that was just the start. This R12 layer was on the outside of the R12 log wall, and he had that 2-inch air gap between the logs and the reeds, which itself added another R2. The total R value of his wall system was approaching R26, more than double that of a standard log cabin. His roof, with a similar treatment, was close to R30. The numbers for heat loss are staggering. A typical 16-hour, 20-foot uninsulated log cabin in a Wisconsin winter, with an outside temperature of 34 degrees and an inside temperature of 68 degrees, a 102-degree difference, would lose heat at a rate of roughly $42,000 BTU per hour. That's the equivalent of burning 42,000 wooden kitchen matches every hour, just to stay even. It's an enormous thermal hemorrhage. Cesare's cabin, with its envelope of still air, changed the equation entirely. His heat loss under the same conditions dropped to an estimated 8,000 BTU per hour. The difference is hard to overstate. It meant that a small, efficient potbelly stove, the kind that would barely take the chill off a conventional cabin, could keep his home comfortably warm. It meant that instead of needing 15 cords of wood, he would need maybe 3. The work of an entire summer of logging was reduced to a few weeks. He hadn't built a thicker wall to fight the cold. He had built a smarter one. He had wrapped his house in a blanket of the very thing that makes a down comforter warm: millions of tiny pockets of air. That winter, the old-timers said the cold had teeth. It arrived not gradually, but like an invading army from the Arctic. A polar surge, they called it, settled over the Kickapoo Valley and refused to leave. For 12 consecutive nights, the mercury in the thermometers huddled at the bottom, registering a sustained 34 degrees Fahrenheit. A relentless 20-mile-per-hour wind blew from the north, scouring the landscape, driving the effective temperature, the wind chill, into a realm of immediate physical danger. The hoarfrost grew on every surface, a crystalline fungus that coated oak fence rails in a layer 4 inches thick. Metal became brittle as glass. The very air seemed thin and sharp in the lungs. For the settlers in their conventional cabins, it was a state of siege. At the Larson farm, the battle was lost on the second night. The wind found every chink in his log walls, and the cold poured in like a river. The family abandoned the bedrooms and huddled in the single main room, stuffing rags and even clothes into the gaps between the logs. They kept the big stove roaring, a hungry beast that consumed wood at an alarming rate. By the fourth night, they had burned through their supply of dry split oak. Larson began feeding the stove with fence posts, then the old wooden hay rake, and finally, pieces of the furniture from the abandoned rooms. His wife wept as he broke up her grandmother's rocking chair, the wood splintering in the intense cold. They were surviving, but just barely, in a shrinking bubble of warmth, the air thick with smoke and desperation. At the Schmidt house, the tragedy was in the barn. Schmidt, ever meticulous, had banked his barn with hay bales and patched every hole he could find. But the cold was insidious. It didn't need a hole, it seeped through the very boards. On the morning of the fifth day, he found two of his best milk cows frozen standing in their stalls, their eyes wide and cloudy. The chickens were frozen lumps on their roosts. The financial loss was devastating. A year's profit turned to ice. But at Baldassari's folly, something else was happening. Inside the hairy house, it was normal. The small potbelly stove in the corner glowed with a gentle, steady warmth, consuming a mere handful of logs every few hours. There were no drafts. The inside walls, the logs themselves, were cool to the touch, but not cold, protected from the polar air by their 4-inch coat of reeds. Julia moved about the cabin in her house dress, not bundled in layers of wool. The children, Marco and Sophia, sat on the floor playing with wooden blocks, their cheeks rosy not from cold, but from the comfortable warmth. The ultimate proof, the detail that captured the impossible reality, sat on an inner shelf. For Carnevale, the festival before Lent, Julia had made a large crock of polenta e osse, a traditional dish from their region, a soft, warm cornmeal porridge with small roasted birds. It was a dish meant to be eaten warm. In any other cabin in the valley, that crock, sitting on a shelf away from the fire, would have been a frozen brick within an hour. The cold would have leached the heat from it instantly. But in Cesare's cabin, the ambient temperature was so stable, the lack of cold radiation from the walls so complete, that the polenta stayed warm and soft through the entire evening. Hours after the fire had been banked for the night, Cesare could still dip a spoon in and find the porridge yielding and soft. It was a small, domestic miracle, a testament to the fact that the cold had not been invited in. The house wasn't fighting the winter, it was simply ignoring it. Rutherford Poindexter was having the worst week of his professional life. His job as building inspector required him to travel his circuit, checking on remote farmsteads and new constructions, ensuring compliance, and, in a winter like this, offering what advice he could. It was a grim tour. He saw families burning their furniture, livestock frozen in their barns, and a pervasive bone-deep misery that settled on the valley like the frost. He traveled by horse-drawn sled, a heavy oak and iron affair, and the cold was his constant, unwelcome companion. He was bundled in the heaviest wool and canvas, with a buffalo robe over his lap, but the cold found its way in, numbing his feet, his hands, his very soul. On the 10th day of the polar surge, his route took him past the Baldassari place. He almost didn't stop. The thought of confronting the stubborn Italian about his ridiculous, flammable house was too exhausting. But duty was duty. As he guided his tired horse towards the gate, there was a loud crack, sharp and violent in the still, frigid air. The sled lurched, dropping on one side. Poindexter cursed. He climbed down into the deep snow, the cold hitting him like a physical blow. The front left runner of his sled, a thick piece of seasoned oak, had snapped clean through. Brittle from the extreme cold, it had failed. He was stranded. His horse was exhausted, and the nearest farm was Larson's, over a mile away. A mile in this wind and this cold could be a death sentence. He looked at Baldassari's cabin, the strange, hairy structure sitting silently in the snow-blasted landscape. It was the only shelter available. Swallowing his pride, and with a deep sense of dread, he began wading through the deep drifts toward the house. His plan was to knock on the door and beg shelter, but as he approached the north wall, the side taking the full, brutal force of the 20-mile-per-hour Arctic wind, he stumbled. He threw out a hand to steady himself against the wall, expecting to feel a surface as cold and hard as a tombstone. He braced for the painful shock of his bare skin against a super-chilled surface. It never came. What his palm touched was impossible. It wasn't warm, not like a stove. It was neutral. It felt like touching a piece of furniture inside a heated room. There was no bite of cold, no frost. He pulled his glove off, his fingers stiff and aching, and pressed his bare hand flat against the cattail bundles. He leaned in, his face close to the wall, trying to understand what his senses were telling him. He expected to feel the icy sting of the wind driving through the reeds. Instead, he felt an almost imperceptible zone of calm, still air. The surface of the cattail bundles, the very front line in the war against 34-degree air, felt as warm as a sun-baked brick in summer. It was actively defying the laws of winter as he knew them. In that moment, standing in a blizzard, leaning against a wall of swamp weeds, Rutherford Poindexter's entire professional worldview shattered. Everything he knew about construction, about heat and cold, was wrong. He had seen the citation he wrote as a defense of sound principles. He now saw it as the work of a blind man, arguing about color. He walked to the door, his mind reeling, and knocked. The door was opened by Cesare Baldassari. Behind him, Poindexter could see the children playing on the floor. He could feel a wave of gentle, humid warmth, smelling faintly of wood smoke and cooking. It was not the blasting, dry heat of an overworked stove, but the deep, steady comfort of a space utterly at peace with its climate. "Mr. Poindexter," Cesare said, his voice showing no surprise, no triumph. "You are in trouble?" Poindexter couldn't speak for a moment. He just stared into the impossible haven. "My sled," he stammered. "The runner?" "Come in," Cesare said, opening the door wider. "Come in, from the cold." Poindexter stepped inside. The transition was breathtaking. The howling wind was gone, replaced by a profound silence. The searing cold on his face was replaced by a gentle, encompassing warmth. He took off his hat, his hands shaking slightly, not from cold, but from revelation. He looked at the simple, small stove burning with a low, quiet fire. He looked at the smooth, dry inner walls. He looked at the crock of polenta on the shelf. He looked at Cesare, the quiet man who had been an object of his professional scorn. "Baldassari," Poindexter said, his voice thick with awe, "you didn't build a wall. You built a coat of summer air." The conversion of Rutherford Poindexter was as total as it was sudden. He stayed for 2 hours, warming his bones and absorbing the reality of the cabin. He used a pocket thermometer, 68 degrees in the center of the room, 65 degrees near the walls. Outside, it was 34. He left not just with a repaired sled runner, which Cesare skillfully mended with iron straps and surprising strength, but with a new gospel. He was no longer a skeptic. He was an apostle. The first thing he did upon returning to Viroqua was march into the county clerk's office and tear up the citation he had issued to Cesare Baldassari. He then spent the next hour explaining to a baffled clerk why a house wrapped in cattails was the warmest, safest, and most efficient structure in the entire county. Word spread, carried by Poindexter himself. He told the story to anyone who would listen. At the general store, at the feed mill, at church gatherings, he described the warmth, the quiet, the shocking efficiency. He described pressing his bare hand to the north wall in a blizzard and feeling no cold. The mockery that had surrounded Baldassari's folly quickly turned to curiosity, and then to outright admiration. The true validation, however, came from the Italian-American community. News of Cesare's success reached Chicago, home to a vibrant Italian population and a widely read newspaper, L'Italia. A reporter was dispatched to Genoa Township. He interviewed Cesare, meticulously documenting the construction method, the harvesting, the drying, the bundling, the lashing. He interviewed Poindexter, who provided the official endorsement and the dramatic story of his conversion. In March of 1912, L'Italia published a full-page article with detailed diagrams titled La saggezza della palude. Un contadino del Po insegna al Wisconsin a sconfiggere l'inverno. The wisdom of the marsh. A Po Valley farmer teaches Wisconsin how to defeat winter. The effect was immediate, for the Po Valley immigrants settled in the similar marshy landscapes of Vernon and Crawford counties. The article was a revelation. It wasn't a strange new technology. It was a half-forgotten piece of their own heritage, brilliantly applied to a new and harsher environment. That summer and fall, the Cattail marshes saw a new kind of harvest. By the time the first snows of 1912 arrived, 6 more farmsteads owned by families with names like Rossi, Moretti, and Bianchi had clad their homes and barns in the thick golden coats of canna palustris. The following winter, their fuel consumption dropped by an average of 70%. Their homes were warmer, their livestock healthier, and their lives immeasurably better. Cesare Baldassari's idea had become a regional phenomenon. What Cesare Baldassari did in 1911 was revolutionary, but it was also ancient. He was practicing principles that modern building science would not formalize for another 70 years. His cattail-clad cabin was, in essence, a perfect example of what architects today call an exterior insulation and finish system, EIFS, or a rain screen wall. He placed the primary insulation layer on the outside of the structure, keeping the log walls themselves within the conditioned envelope of the house. This kept the logs warm and dry, preventing the condensation and frost that plagued conventional cabins, and protecting the structure itself. He was decades ahead of his time, using swamp reeds to achieve what modern builders now do with rigid foam and high-tech membranes. He had, through ancestral knowledge, stumbled upon the perfect wall. The story of Cesare Baldassari is more than a lesson in thermodynamics. It is a profound reminder of a different kind of wisdom. The frontier rewarded brute strength, thick walls, and a mindset of opposition to nature. You fought the cold, you battled the winter, you conquered the land. Cesare's approach was entirely different. He didn't see the winter as an enemy to be overpowered. He saw it as a condition to be understood. He didn't build his walls thicker against the cold. He looked at the marsh, the most overlooked and seemingly useless part of his landscape, and saw in its hollow stems a gift. He asked the marsh for a coat, and the marsh provided. He understood that resilience is not always about resistance. Sometimes it is about intelligent adaptation, about finding the elegant, efficient solution that nature itself provides. He didn't build a fortress against winter. He simply wrapped his home in a layer of trapped summer air and lit a small, quiet fire behind it. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this exploration of history, physics, and practical wisdom valuable, please consider supporting our channel by subscribing, liking this video, and sharing it with someone who might appreciate it. Our question for the comments remains: what's the most clever, low-tech solution to a big problem you've ever encountered? We read every comment. Disclaimer: this video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. While the principles of hollow stem insulation and exterior cladding are real, the characters, specific events, and dialogue depicted are fictionalized for narrative effect. The application of any building technique, historical or modern, should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.